There is a particular kind of silence that settles over family history when something has been deliberately left out. Not the silence of forgetting. Forgetting has a softness to it, a gradual blurring at the edges where the shape of the original memory simply dissolves into the general past. The silence surrounding a hidden bloodline is different from that. It has weight. It has shape. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. It feels, to anyone who has ever sat across a kitchen table from an elderly relative and watched them choose their words too carefully, like a door that is always slightly ajar but never opened all the way. You can sense the room behind it. You can sometimes smell the air of it. But no one in the family has handed you the key, and over time you stop asking about the door because everyone around it has agreed, without saying so, that it stays closed. For millions of American families with roots in the Deep South, in Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and the long river valleys reaching down into northern Florida, that silence has a name. It has several names, actually, all pointing toward the same origin point, the Creek Nation, one of the largest, most politically sophisticated, and most deliberately erased indigenous confederacies in the history of this continent. If your family came out of those states, if your grandmother's cheekbones sat high and wide in a way the family always attributed to something vague and European, if certain great-aunts went quiet whenever the subject of Indian blood came up, and then changed the subject with a speed that itself told you something, if a branch of your family tree simply stops in the 1830s with no record of where those people came from before, if your DNA result has returned a percentage of indigenous American ancestry that the family history has no room for, you are holding a thread. What follows is where that thread leads. The Muscogee people, known to colonial administrators and then to American history broadly as the Creek, did not begin as a single unified nation. They were a confederacy, a deliberate and sophisticated gathering of dozens of distinct towns and clans spread across what is now the American Southeast. Hitchiti speakers and Alabamas, Yuchi communities that had been absorbed into the Confederacy across generations of alliance and intermarriage, Natchez survivors who had fled after the destruction of their own nation and found shelter and citizenship among the Creek towns, smaller groups whose original identities were preserved inside the Confederacy's structure even as they became part of the larger whole. The Creek built a political system that recognized the autonomy of individual towns while creating workable mechanisms for collective decision-making and collective defense. By the time European contact had become European pressure in any sustained military and political sense, the Creek Confederacy was one of the most complex indigenous governments operating anywhere on the continent. They also had something that made them a target in a way that purely military hostility cannot fully explain. They had land. Extraordinary, fertile, river-fed land. The Black Belt of Alabama and Georgia, named for the dark richness of its soil, land that sits at the heart of the North American continent's most productive agricultural zone, cotton land. The kind of land that by the early decades of the 19th century, the expanding plantation economy of the American South required in quantities that could only be satisfied by removing the people who already occupied it and had occupied it for centuries. The pressure had been building for decades before the legislation that made removal official policy. Creek families who had lived in mixed communities with European traders and settlers since the early 1700s found themselves reclassified, pressured, and in a significant number of cases simply absorbed into the surrounding population with their Creek ancestry quietly set aside. The children of Creek women and European traders had been part of the Confederacy's political and social fabric for generations. They carried Creek clan membership through their mothers, as the matrilineal custom of the Muscogee people required. They spoke both languages. They held positions of leadership within the Confederacy while also navigating the world of colonial commerce. And when the pressure of the early 1800s arrived and the choice became removal or erasure, a significant number of them chose erasure, because erasure at least meant staying on the land, staying near the rivers, staying in the place the family had always been, even if the identity that had defined that family had to go underground to make it possible. What erasure looked like in practice was not a dramatic ceremony of renunciation. There was no formal moment of unbecoming. A family simply stopped saying certain things. They began listing themselves differently on the documents that were accumulating around American civic life with increasing density during this period. They moved, sometimes only a county or two away from where they had always been, sometimes considerably further, and in the new location they presented themselves as white, or as having mixed Spanish blood from the colonial period, or simply as American, which in the census language of the 1830s and 1840s meant white and otherwise unspecified. Their children grew up knowing something was unspoken without necessarily knowing what it was. Their grandchildren grew up not knowing there was anything to speak of at all. The silence had become complete enough to pass as ordinary family history. The genealogical record shows this pattern with a consistency that is not accidental and cannot be explained by coincidence. Creek families with documented enrollment histories and treaty-era records appear in the Alabama and Georgia census of 1830, listed as white or as free persons of color, reclassified across a single decade, in some cases across a single census cycle, moving from one category to another in the space of 10 years with no migration, no marriage, no event in the family record to account for the change except the political pressure that made the old category dangerous to hold. The surname distributions track this movement. Families named McGillivray, Barnard, Grayson, Durant, Kennard, Perryman, Moniac, and several dozen others representing the intermarried leadership class of the Creek Confederacy turn up in Southern genealogical records after 1830, scattered across counties with no explanation for where those people came from before. The paper trail runs cold at the removal era and picks up again on the other side of it, carrying a new racial designation and a new story about European origins. That new story usually took one of three standard forms that were common enough across these families to have become almost formulaic in their repetition. The first was Cherokee ancestry, which carried significantly less social stigma in many communities than Creek, partly because the Cherokee had a developed written language and a political sophistication that white Americans found easier to romanticize at a safe distance. The second was Portuguese or Spanish descent, a claim that could account for olive complexions and straight dark hair without invoking native blood in any way the surrounding community would have found threatening to the family's legal and social standing. The third was simply silence, no explanation at all. The family was from Georgia or Alabama. The family had always been there. Questions about what came before Georgia were not questions that received answers. The DNA record is where this particular silence begins to speak again, and it speaks in a language that no census classification, no deliberate omission from a family Bible, and no social pressure across 5 or 6 generations can alter. Commercial genetic testing has now been used by tens of millions of American families, and the aggregate results across the major testing platforms show a consistent and documented pattern among families with deep roots in Alabama, Georgia, and Mississippi. A percentage of indigenous American ancestry appears in results where the family history contains no acknowledged native lineage whatsoever. In a significant proportion of cases, this percentage falls between 2 and 8%, which corresponds roughly to a Creek great-great-grandparent or great-great-great-grandparent, someone living in the removal era whose identity the family record simply does not contain. In a smaller but still substantial number of cases, the percentage is considerably higher, ranging from 12 to 20% or above, suggesting a closer ancestor, a grandparent or a great-grandparent whose identity was managed out of the family story within living memory of someone still alive today. The haplogroup data adds a second layer of specificity to this picture. Mitochondrial haplogroup A, which traces through the maternal line and is carried by a child from its mother regardless of who the father was, appears at elevated rates in populations with demonstrable Creek and Muscogee ancestry. Specific subclades of haplogroup B and haplogroup C also show distribution patterns consistent with southeastern indigenous populations rather than with European or African origins. When a DNA result returns one of these maternal haplogroups in a family that is always identified as entirely European in origin, the result is not a statistical anomaly. It is a genealogical record written in a medium that predates every census, every treaty, every family decision made around a kitchen table about what would and would not be said going forward. The Creek removal itself was not a single event occurring on a single date that history could mark cleanly and move past. It was a process that stretched across roughly 2 decades, grinding and incremental, built from a series of treaties that progressively stripped away Creek sovereignty and Creek landholding until the remaining population had no viable legal ground to stand on. The Treaty of Fort Jackson in 1814 stripped the Creek of approximately 23 million acres in the aftermath of the Creek War, itself partly a civil war within the Confederacy between factions who had allied with American military forces and those who had chosen to resist American expansion. The subsequent treaties, Fort Mitchell in 1821, Washington in 1826, and Cusseta in 1832, reduced Creek landholdings by successive stages until removal became, in the framing of federal policy, the only remaining administrative option. The Cusseta Treaty is particularly relevant to any genealogical investigation of Creek ancestry in Southern families because of one specific provision it contained. It offered individual Creek citizens the option to take an allotment of land in Alabama and remain as American citizens rather than remove to Indian Territory west of the Mississippi. Some Creek families took that option. A significant proportion of those who took it found in the years that followed that the allotment system had been structured in ways that made holding onto the land essentially impossible over time. Fraud, legal pressure, outright theft of land through manufactured debt, and in some cases direct violence stripped most Creek allottees of their land within a decade of the treaty. But those families stayed in Alabama. They became part of the southern rural population, with no formal tribal affiliation, no legal recognition of their Creek citizenship, and no practical mechanism for maintaining a Creek identity in the social environment they now inhabited. They are in the census records of Alabama and Georgia in the 1840s and 1850s listed as white, because by then, whiteness was the only classification that carried legal protection. The physical description evidence moves through county histories and family narratives in a way that genealogists working these lines have documented across generations of research. References to dark complexions and straight black hair that the family attributed to French ancestry or to a long-ago Spanish forebear from the colonial period. The term Black Dutch, which appears with striking frequency in family histories from the Appalachian South and the Deep South more broadly, has been analyzed by genealogists as a catch-all phrase that covered a range of non-European ancestries, among them Creek and other southeastern indigenous lineages, in communities where claiming that ancestry directly would have carried social and legal consequences. When a family history says the dark features and the particular bone structure came from the Black Dutch side, that claim is worth treating as a redirect rather than an explanation. The naming patterns in the genealogical record constitute another form of evidence that runs alongside the physical and the genetic. Creek families had naming traditions that even after assimilation left marks in the documents. Place names across Alabama and Georgia derived from Muscogee language appear with concentration in the counties where Creek towns stood before removal, and families living in those counties carry those place names in their histories in ways that sometimes trace back to residents in specific Creek towns. Surnames that present as vaguely English on the surface sometimes trace their origin to anglicizations of Creek personal names processed through the phonetic limitations of whoever was keeping the record at the moment of documentation. A man recorded in an 1835 county tax record under a name that looks English may carry in that name a transformation of something that announced his Creek identity clearly to anyone in the original community who heard it. But that became unreadable as such 2 generations later when the family was firmly established in a different identity category. The survival of specific cultural practices in families that carried no acknowledged native ancestry is a line of evidence that anthropologists and folklorists working in the Deep South have traced with considerable care across the 20th century. Particular approaches to plant medicine, to food preparation, to the treatment of the dead and the rituals surrounding death and burial, to the structure of family obligation running through the maternal line rather than the paternal, persisted in communities with documented Creek ancestry well past the point where any other visible marker of that ancestry remained. Women who remembered their grandmothers doing particular things with particular plants, maintaining particular silences around particular subjects, structuring family relationships in ways that did not quite match the patriarchal European model the surrounding culture reinforced, sometimes carry genealogical knowledge encoded in cultural practice that the written record was stripped of. The Dawes rolls, the final enrollment records for the 5 civilized tribes conducted between 1898 and 1914, represent the last official opportunity for Creek descendant families to formally claim that ancestry within the legal framework of the federal government's tribal recognition system. Many did not take that opportunity. By the time enrollment was open, the social cost of being identified as Indian in the Deep South had been established clearly across several generations of lived experience. Families that had successfully presented as white for 50 or 60 years were not going to jeopardize the standing that protected their land, their legal rights, and their children's futures for an enrollment certificate that carried its own risks in the political environment of the Jim Crow South. The Dawes rolls are therefore an incomplete record of Creek ancestry in Southern families, not a definitive one. Families whose direct ancestors do not appear in the rolls may still carry that lineage. The absence from the rolls is evidence of the pressure that made enrollment dangerous to claim, not evidence of the bloodline's absence. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The geographic distribution of families with likely Creek ancestry today tracks closely with the removal-era migration patterns and the post-removal dispersal of Creek families who managed to stay east of the Mississippi. After the main removal events of 1836 and 1837, Creek people who had avoided deportation moved into the lower value land of the Mississippi piney woods, the Florida Panhandle, and the coastal counties of southern Alabama, areas where land pressure was lower and scrutiny was thinner, where a family of ambiguous appearance and ambiguous documentation could establish themselves across a generation or two and build a life without extensive examination of what came before. The surnames of these families, when traced back through the county records into the removal era, often connect to Creek town names, to the records maintained by Creek trading firms operating in the region in the early decades of the 19th century, or to the enrollment applications that were submitted to the Dawes Commission and rejected on procedural grounds, rejections that had more to do with the political pressure to limit enrollment numbers and protect land allocation than with the actual ancestry of the people applying. There are families in Clark County in Alabama, in Escambia County in Florida, in Jones County and Jasper County in Mississippi, whose oral traditions have maintained across 4 and 5 and 6 generations that their ancestors were Creek, that the family had concealed it because concealment was survival, and that the documents required to prove it formally were either never created at the time or were lost or destroyed in the decades that followed. The genealogists who have worked these particular lines over the past several decades report a pattern consistent enough to be predictive. The oral tradition is usually right. When the DNA comes back, when the land records from before 1830 are located in state archives and cross-referenced with treaty documents, when the annuity payment rolls of the 1820s and 1830s are matched against the county records of the following decade, the oral tradition holds. The family knew, they simply stopped saying it out loud, and they taught their children not to say it, and those children taught their own children the same lesson, and by the time the great-grandchildren arrived, there was nothing left to teach because the knowledge itself had been successfully buried. The physical evidence of that knowing sometimes survives in the most unexpected places. A family Bible with names in it that do not correspond to the story the family tells about itself. A land patent from the 1820s listing an ancestor as a Creek citizen receiving an allotment under the provisions of a treaty whose existence the family has no memory of. A death certificate from 1920 or 1930 that lists the decedent's race as Indian in a family that had been recorded as white for 2 full generations, because the physician who completed the certificate knew the family personally, or because an elderly person at the end of a long life stopped managing the category and let the record say what it knew. A photograph kept at the back of a drawer in which the faces carry something that does not fit the European ancestry the family claims, in a way that is entirely consistent with what a single generation of distance from a Creek grandparent would produce. The Creek Nation of Oklahoma and the Poarch Band of Creek Indians in Alabama, the 2 federally recognized Creek tribal nations today, maintain genealogical research programs specifically oriented toward families seeking to trace and document Creek ancestry. The records they hold include annuity rolls from the removal era, treaty-era citizenship documents organized by Creektown, and cross-referenced name lists that can connect a family name appearing in an Alabama county history to a specific Creek town of origin and a specific clan affiliation going back before the removal. These records have reconnected families to lineages that were severed nearly 2 centuries ago, and the work of reconnection is ongoing. For anyone whose DNA has returned Indigenous American ancestry in a range suggesting a fairly recent ancestor and whose family roots run through Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, or the Florida Panhandle, the Creek connection is the most probable place for the genealogical investigation to begin. The census records from 1830 and before, held in state archives and available through genealogical databases, the treaty-era land records from the Creek allotment period, the annuity payment rolls maintained by the federal government for Creek citizens during the treaty negotiation period of the 1820s and 1830s. The Dawes rolls themselves, including both the enrollment records and the rejection records, because the rejection files contain genealogical information about the applicants, even where the application was ultimately denied. All of this constitutes an archive that is substantially intact, increasingly digitized, and substantially searchable by anyone willing to spend time in it. There is a particular document type that genealogists working Creek ancestry have learned to treat as a primary source even when it appears, on its surface, to contain almost no information. The Creek census records compiled by Creek Nation officials in the decades before removal, primarily in the 1820s and 1830s, list Creek citizens by town of residence and sometimes by clan affiliation. These records use names that in many cases appear in a form different from what those same individuals would later be recorded under by American census takers. A man listed in a Creek Nation census as Tustanuga Hadjo in the 1825 records might appear in an Alabama county record of 1840 as Thomas Hadjo, and might appear in an 1850 record, if his family had moved and reclassified, under a surname derived from Hadjo, anglicized into something that reads as a common English name to anyone not looking for the Creek origin. The connection between the Creek Nation record and the American census record is rarely obvious. It requires the kind of cross-referencing that most families, buried in the ordinary work of living, never had occasion to do. The Creek War of 1813 and 1814 is another entry point that Southern genealogists have used to trace Creek ancestry through the military records it generated. The war produced documentation on both sides of the conflict. Creek fighters who allied with American forces appear in records associated with General Andrew Jackson's campaigns. Creek fighters who resisted, the Red Sticks as they came to be called, appear in military records on the opposing side. But the post-war period is in some ways more useful genealogically, because the land cessions that followed the Treaty of Fort Jackson required surveys and land distributions that generated records of who was living where and under what status. Families appearing in those surveys in counties that had been Creek territory represent a documented population of Creek people and Creek-affiliated mixed heritage families at a specific moment in time, before the reclassification pressure of the following 2 decades had done its full work. The missionary records from the Creek Nation during the removal era are another source that has been underused in genealogical research. Several Protestant missionary societies established stations in Creek territory in the 1810s and 1820s, and the records those missionaries kept, baptism registers, correspondence, school enrollment lists, accounts of the communities they were working in, contain names, family relationships, and settlement patterns that sometimes survive where official American records do not. A Creek family that appears in a missionary record in 1822 and then disappears from the official American record after 1835 did not cease to exist. They reclassified, or they removed to Indian territory, or they dispersed into the surrounding population. The missionary record is sometimes the last document that shows them as who they were before the pressure to become someone else became impossible to resist. The question of what happened to Creek people who removed to Indian territory is relevant to families researching Southern ancestry because the removal itself was not always permanent in the direction it moved. Some Creek families who were removed to Indian territory in the 1830s returned east in subsequent decades, particularly after the Civil War disrupted the settlements that had been established in what is now Oklahoma. Creek individuals appear in Southern state records in the 1870s and 1880s, having come back or having never fully left, settling in communities where Creek ancestry was known but no longer officially acknowledged. Their descendants are part of the genealogical population that the Dawes rolls missed, not because their Creek lineage was less real, but because the migration patterns that brought their families back east placed them outside the geographic and administrative boundaries of the enrollment process. The silence that settled over these families across the 1830s and 1840s was not a moral failure by the people who maintained it. It was a survival strategy, deployed and maintained across generations in a social and legal environment where the consequences of being identified as native were specific and serious. Loss of land rights under laws that treated Indian land titles as provisional, loss of legal standing in courts that did not extend the same protections to native plaintiffs and witnesses, loss of the social position that made it possible to educate your children, hold on to the land you had worked, and pass something forward to the generation after you. The families that went quiet made the calculation that the survival of the bloodline mattered more than the acknowledgement of it, and the genome carried what the family record could not. What the DNA shows, 4 and 5 and 6 generations later, is that the record was suppressed but not erased. The haplogroup does not respond to census classifications. The percentage of indigenous ancestry that appears in a result does not diminish because a family moved counties in 1838 and listed itself differently. What was carried forward in silence is still there, still readable, still connected by unbroken biological thread to the towns along the Tallapoosa and the Coosa and the Chattahoochee where it began, still carrying the markers of the matrilineal clans whose names the family stopped saying sometime in the 1830s and never quite started saying again. The 8 signs, assembled from the genealogical record and the genetic evidence, are not individually definitive. Any one of them, taken alone, might be coincidence or misinterpretation. Taken together, they constitute a pattern that is worth following. A family from Alabama or Georgia with no documented ancestry before the 1830s. A DNA result showing 2 to 20% Indigenous American ancestry in a family that claims none. A mitochondrial haplogroup in the A, B, or relevant C subclades appearing in a maternal line with southern roots. A family tradition of dark complexions and straight dark hair attributed to Portuguese blood or Black Dutch ancestry or some other European explanation that was never quite convincing. A phrase in family oral history that referenced native ancestry, with the instruction that it not be mentioned outside the family. Surnames that appear in Creek trading records, annuity rolls, or treaty-era documents. Land records that end cleanly, and without explanation at the removal era with nothing before them. And the particular silence that lives in the space between what the older generation was willing to say and what the younger generation was allowed to ask. Those 8 things, together, are an argument. They are a genealogical argument written across 190 years of American history, built from federal documents and county records and family Bibles, and the genome itself, assembled by the accumulated weight of what could not be fully suppressed, no matter how complete the silence around it became. The Creek Confederacy was one of the most extraordinary political structures in pre-removal North America. It survived European contact and colonial-era warfare and the first several decades of American expansion. What it could not survive intact was the removal of 1836 and the policies that followed it. But the blood moved forward, the genome moved forward, the oral tradition, imperfect and partial and sometimes disguised as something else entirely, moved forward. And here it is, arriving at whoever is reading this, still carrying its original meaning, still waiting for someone to read it correctly. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.